Good evening, Dr. Roy. Welcome to the webinar on scrub typhus, neglected but lethal. It's, the subject line, I think it does justice to your background in the Indian Army, right? Lethal is the word. We'll just wait for people to join in. As you can see on the bottom, you can see the number of participants is going up. We've got about 41 people, 40 people right now. And let's just give it a minute or two for people to join.
Sure, absolutely. Not a problem at all.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this JMitra webinar with our guest and subject matter expert, Col.Dr. Partha Roy. Dr. Roy, with your permission, I'd like to start the proceedings.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our JMitra scientific webinar entitled Scrub Typhus, Neglected but Lethal. Over the past few years, in fact, decades, scrub typhus has emerged as a strong disease, a killer, a silent killer, although, and a neglected killer because most of us fail to see the signs, whether it be the medical fraternity, whether it be the testing fraternity, and whether it be the people at large. We at JMitra have always envisaged serving mankind, and part of serving mankind is creating an awareness of certain new diseases that they're not new diseases, but they exist and they have not been neglected so far. We are very happy to welcome with us again. It is a pleasure to host Col.Dr. Partha Roy. He is an MD and a PhD. PhD, if I recall correctly, in virology, sir. Right?
Yes.
And it's you are a leading light, as they call it, in certain fields, especially in transfusion medicine, in virology. And I have gone through some of the papers that you've written, sir, very detailed, in fact. It's a great pleasure to have you on board with us, Colonel Roy. And need I say more? The forum is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And at the very outset, I must thank JMitra for giving us the platform to discuss this important topic. And I guess that this topic actually would be close to the heart of many people. Having said that, it's not a new disease. It's one of the very old disease. And so with your permission, I think without any delay, I would share my screen and start working on this.
Over to you, sir.
Just a second, please. Okay, so let me start with this topic. The tagline of this topic, neglected but lethal, I would try to explain over my talk over the next 20-30 minutes that why am I calling it neglected and why I'm calling it lethal and why should this be part of our everyday testing curriculum, especially in India. Well, as you know, it's an academic discussion, and all the data inputs and illustrations that I have gathered are from legitimate studies and paper that is available in the public domain, and that includes the electronic media. So I am thankful for them because they were available to me. However, if there are any discrepancies in that, I would be happy if that is brought to the notice. So we will look into it. Uh, historically, typhus fever have claimed more soldiers than actual warfare. Now, this is not my saying. This is what the Frederick II of Prussia said during one of his sad situations when he lost a lot of soldiers due to typhus fever. And how dangerous it is, that can be understood by the fact that two major scientists working with that rickettsial disease, that is rickets and Prozac, both actually contracted typhus fever in their laboratories while working with them, and they died. So it's a dangerous disease. So that's the historical aspect of it. Now, scrub typhus is also called bush typhus because it is associated with bushes and environment, and it is caused by a bacteria, a part of the rickettsial family, but it's no longer called the Rickettsia-Tsutsugamushi, but it's called the Orientia-Tsutsugamushi. Mind you, it's a very, very small bacteria. It does not behave exactly like other bacteria that we are quite conversant with. And it is transmitted to humans through infected chiggers, like it's a hard tick sort of a thing, and also especially the larval forms of those mites. It is present worldwide, mostly in the tropical area. That includes Southeast Asia, Indonesia, India, Northern Australia. And people who are traveling to scrub typhus areas where these islands are there, so they have to be doubly careful that they could be bitten by a chigger and they may contract scrub typhus. So they have to be careful about it. This is a common precaution taken in military medicine, where people are moving in various kinds of patrols, etc. A few important points before starting the full lecture. I would say that any fever in the monsoon season should raise the clinical suspicion. However, typhus fever or scrub typhus does mimic various other febrile illnesses like typhoid, malaria, dengue, leptospira, etc., depending on what kind of disease are prevalent there, especially area where there are waterlogging, where there is flooding of the sewers, etc. Leptospira might be mimicked by scrub typhus also. The problem with scrub typhus is that if not treated, it has a high morbidity and a high death rate, especially people who are working in the fields like agricultural workers, as well as the military people or people who are mostly on the ground, even pregnant patients, women, they are at high risk. And over the period of time, like any other bacteria, even Orientia, rickettsial diseases are developing resistance, and this resistance is leading to faster spread. Therefore, for all the clinical fraternity, prompt diagnosis, treatment, and management is the key. Otherwise, we are going to lose a lot of patients. Now, when we talk about the chigger, this is something what it looks like, looks very dangerous. However, if you see the right photograph, you'll find that, actually it is a very small little insect. Just, it's like a speck on your nails, but it can bite and you will not even come to know about it. And this must be happening quite often. People who have got pets, if there are hard ticks, etc., you also get bitten, so you don't give too much of attention to it. So this is how the disease spreads from the larval mites. Usually, after being bitten, within about 10 days or so, the patient, in case it is infected chigger, he develops symptoms of scrub typhus, comes with fever, chills, headache, body ache, and muscle pain. So you will realize that all these features are common for most of the febrile illness, whether it is dengue, whether it is chikungunya, whether it's any other viral fever, even malaria, typhoid, even it could be Zika also. So all these are very common findings. So scrub typhus is also on them. However, usually in people whose skin is clear, there is a rash and an eschar develops. Now, what's an eschar? Eschar is, if you see on the top picture, you find it's a scab where the mite has bitten. It forms a scab-like region, and that's called an eschar. Unfortunately, these rashes and eschar may not be visible in a dark-skinned individual, so high clinical suspicion will remain the key in these cases. In case it is not treated well, so the patient then develops full-blown scrub typhus. There could be mental changes ranging from confusion to coma. He will have local enlargement of lymph nodes, and then they may go into a severe illness that may lead to organ failure, bleeding, and there may be a fair amount of mortality if left untreated. So that's very important for us. So as we have just got a little bit of hint that how it gets infected, humans get infected. So basically it is a zoonotic disease. When we say zoonotic disease, that means that usually it is present in the animals. And in this case, man is an accidental host. So since it is an accidental host and the life cycle actually goes through rodents and other small little mammals and the mite, and man gets infected. So there is no person-to-person spread per se in case of scrub typhus. So if you see this picture, which is interesting, what you can see is, the yellow part is something which is under the ground where you can see the larval mite developing into adult, forming its egg and again into larva. And usually the cycle is completed through the rodent, which is the primary animal, and there may be other small animals also. So what happens is that the larva picks up the rickettsia from these rodents, and then there is multiplication, and many of these rickettsia or orientia is passed on to the next generation through transoverally. That means mother to child kind of a transmission or a vertical transmission. And these areas are called mite islands. So humans, when they come here, whether it's a soldier or whether it's working, and this larva accidentally bites him, so he gets this disease. So this is how the transmission takes place of the scrub typhus. Now, why do we say that scrub typhus is important? Of course, because it mimics other diseases. There is high degree of mortality, and now this disease is also developing resistance. So we got to know a little more about this disease. Okay, so our knowledge about the exact statistics of scrub typhus is not very, very good. There are a lot of gaps. What we know is that scrub typhus is an endemic illness. That means it is well entrenched into our system. It happens. It is not something like that suddenly it comes from some other place like COVID had come or say swine flu had come. No, it happens routinely in our environment. And amongst all the severe rickettsial diseases, there's endemic typhus, epidemic typhus, Rocky Mountain fever, etc. This is the most common and most severe, that is scrub typhus. It seems that cases are increasing each year because of actual increase and also better detection of the cases, and significant case fatality occurs, which we have been saying for a long time. Now, as far as public health is concerned, it is a serious public health in India, because there is a large number of agricultural land, there's a lot of bushes, and our population is still rural based. So it is a serious threat, but it's still quite uncertain that how widespread and burdensome this scrub typhus is. And there are studies done, people have done their studies, all of them are not in congruence, but generally we get some ideas. So I will discuss that with you. So this particular picture that you find, that's like a pyramid. So what you find is at the bottom of this pyramid, you see that in our rural areas, almost more than 80% of people are exposed to the risk of developing scrub typhus because they walk barefoot, they are kind of always in contact with the environment, the soil, the jungles, the bushes, etc. And amongst them, agricultural laborers are more than about 50%. Very interestingly, it seems that the community seroprevalence, that means if you test the person for antibodies of scrub typhus, you might find that almost about 35% of them have sometimes suffered from this disease subclinically or clinically. Now, whenever we talk nowadays, febrile illnesses, which we have not been able to actually diagnose, which we call as FUO or PUO, now we have a terminology like acute and differentiated febrile illness. It looks like that in some cases, almost 25% of these PUO cases in India could be because of scrub typhus. And if untreated, 20% gets admitted into ICU. Many of them have to be placed into ventilators, and many of them will go into multiple organ dysfunction. And 6 to 7% of cases will actually die. So case fatality rate looks like about 6 to 7%, which is fairly high. So this is what we have to really look into. Now, you see this particular diagram. So what we will find is that scrub typhus can give rise to a lot of complications, singly or in bunches. For example, a person having a shock can also have myocarditis, meningitis, hepatitis, or kidney failure. So you find that there are two bars into this. One is the yellow colored bar and one is the orangish or reddish colored bar. The yellow bar is the prevalence or the incidence of the complications, and once that happens, how much is the mortality. So you find that in case a patient has developed myocarditis, which is not very common, but if he develops myocarditis, there is a 42.4% chance of that person actually dying. Similarly, in case of meningitis, or in case of shock, or in case of say acute kidney failure, the mortality rates are very high. And the moment a person has got 2 or 3 complications together, which is quite common, you find that the person gets the mortality is fairly high in these cases. So keeping this in mind, we need to identify and detect scrub typhus much earlier before it has actually caused these complications and has involved other organs. Okay. Now, in the Indian scenario, still says that it is mostly in the South India, but I will show you a picture in which a graph or a map which will show you the geographical distribution. It affects farmers, and of course, it affects the military person. Most of our military person are in those areas, in the border areas, especially in the northeastern region, in the region of Punjab, and in the region of Jammu and Kashmir also, where these grasslands are there and people can get affected. Now, let us have a look at this particular picture. Now, by no means this picture is absolutely perfect. But generally, what we get the idea is the southern part of the country has a high prevalence rate of scrub typhus. Similarly, in the area of Rajasthan or Uttar Pradesh, or in case of Meghalaya, and also other parts of northeastern region, it is fairly prevalent. Now, whatever is shown in yellow, that means that the cases are less than 500. But then what happens is that these are the areas where there is a lot of movement of military personnel, a lot of movement of security staff, a lot of movement of the local population there. So although the mite islands are less, but people are actually exposed much more because of their frequent movements. People are spending their nights in the open grasslands or places where there are bushes. So people get affected and they get a fever, and over a period of time they may get scrub typhus multiple times. They develop a bit of immunity towards it, so they don't bother much. But as I said, seroprevalence is almost 35 to 50%. In some cases, it will maybe even higher. So this is the picture you see. Orange ones are about 500 to 1500 cases, and then you have the red ones, and then you have the blackish or the brownish one, which is in Tamil Nadu. So what I would say is that there are certain areas where sufficient data collection may not have been done, but overall I can say this entire Indian subcontinent is an endemic zone for scrub typhus. So this is again a bar diagram picturization, and you find that it is South India and North India which has the burden. But then, as I said, it must be there elsewhere also. The data collection and the data is not complete in our cases. Okay. So in these cases, what we do is that we have understood the clinical syndromes, we have understood the public health part of it, we have seen what all kind of complications can occur. So now it is the most important thing is the laboratory diagnosis. Till as on date, the mainstay of diagnosis remains the antibody-based serological testing. And in case the clinician or people are very, very significantly suspicious of a case, and they do a molecular characterization like a PCR or something in the first week of symptoms, scrub typhus can be diagnosed both using molecular and specific serological tests like IgM positivity, etc., or taking samples from the SCHAR, doing an immunofluorescence assay and things like that. But then many a times the patient does not come to the doctor with mild fever or minimal fever, and it is then missed. So overall, there are two types of diagnostic modalities. One is what is called a direct test, in which we directly look towards the organism and see if that is there. And then there are indirect tests where mostly we depend on the serological tests and various antibody detections, which we do. So let's talk about the direct tests. So usually there are two types of direct tests. One is the molecular tests that we do. It's very common nowadays and very popular, like PCRs, etc. And the second one is a little research-based study, like a cell or tissue culture. So the molecular tests, that is the PCRs, etc., are very, very sensitive and rapid. It is a very good test. It can be done from the blood. However, in case you can find an SCHAR or area where the bite is there, that area sampling will be much better because the organisms will be concentrated on those areas. The problem with PCR is that it is not available routinely in rural areas. You have to establish a molecular lab. You have to have a very trained technician. The entire setup is fairly expensive and labor intensive, and day-to-day running cost of these tests are also prohibitive. The second one, that is the gold standard, is to actually grow these organisms in your laboratory and do some tests on that. However, there is a major word of caution that first and foremost, these rickettsial organisms do not behave like other bacteria. They do not grow in normal media in the laboratory, like blood agar or something like that. So you have to use cell lines for them. Same thing goes for other smaller bacteria like mycoplasma and chlamydia. And it's a very risky thing, because it requires a BSL-4 level of recommended level of BSL-4 for cultivation of rickettsia or Orientia, as the case may be in this case. And laboratory transmission of this organism to humans are known. And in the first slide that I said, gentleman called Ricketts and Provazek actually expired. So in my alma mater, Armed Forces Medical College, there have been a large number of very, very efficient scientists who had done studies on rickettsia, and we did some additional studies. I also did when I was in FMC with the National Institute of Virology, where they had a BSL-4 laboratory. But overall, it is for research purposes. It requires extremely high level of expertise and high level of infrastructure and high level of biocontainment. So these are not very commonly used. Molecular tests, yes, it is possible. So we come down to the indirect test. These indirect tests are the one then which we depend upon. So one of the best test is the ELISA based test, that is the detection of the IgG and IgM. Also the very old heterophile antibody based test called Wheel-Felix test, that's also now available in the market. You can do a rapid CAR test, which is called a immunochromatographic test, which is usually a point of care testing, that is for screening. You don't require much equipments for that. Apart from that, other high-end tests, which are indirect tests like immunofluorescence assay or immunoperoxidase assay, can also be done, but these are done in certain reference centers only. So let us go one by one on these tests. Now, let's talk about the ELISA test. Now, ELISA test is practical and popular. It is extremely sensitive, it is specific, and it is very easy to perform. And a person, laboratory technician who has been trained in the ELISA techniques can do this test without any problem. However, for this, you do require an ELISA reader. And sometimes, because there is some amount of mutation continues to happen, and in any of the indirect tests, antibody-based tests, sometimes some of the serotypes may not be detected, but usually that is not a problem. ELISA works very well. Initially, as you know, if it is a primary infection, you will be detecting the IgM like you do a Typhus.IgM. Here also, you first detect the IgM, and subsequently, the IgM level goes down and the IgG level continues to come up. And there are usually 3 to 4-fold increase over a period of time, and then it goes down over a period of time. But over a period of time, certain amount continues to remain circulating in the blood. So that is what we detect as seroprevalence. Now, Wheel-Felix test, it's never complete. ScrubTyphus is never complete without Wheel-Felix test. So these two gentlemen had designed this test. It's a very, very old test, maybe almost about 100-150-year-old, but it is still very popular. It was based on a kind of an accidental discovery that Proteus organism has certain antigens, some specific strains of Proteus mirabilis and Proteus vulgaris has certain antigens which are similar to the rickettsial organisms antigens, and there are so usually there are 3 antigens which are used, called OX19, OX2, and OXK. OXK is specific for ScrubTyphus, and for the rest of it, the other diseases are there, like epidemic typhus, endemic typhus, even diseases called Brilzinser's disease, trench fever, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So in these cases, either OX19 or OX2 or both are positive, especially in Rocky Mountain fever. But OXK is positive only for ScrubTyphus. So this is a good test where all the rickettsial diseases can be tested. And a 4-fold rise in titer is diagnostic. However, the technology part of it is that it's an heterophile test, antibody test, and it is not a direct antibody testing of for ScrubTyphus. A lot of people feel that this test should be replaced by more specific tests, but in Indian condition, this still tends to work, and there is a lot of concordance between them. But yes, cross reactivity can definitely occur. Now, when we talk about the ICT or the CAR test, it's, as I said, it is a point of care testing when you don't have the facility of doing a ELISA or a PCR and you want to do a screening test. You have kits where you have got the IgG and IgM. Both are available. So these are the rapid test. So screening test. So if the clinical suspicion is very high, it's a good test actually. If it is confirmed subsequently using a ELISA or a PCR, then of course this test will be very, very useful. So these are the tests that are available in your armamentarium. So before I finish, I would like to give a few conclusive remarks on that, which can be taken as a final, not a final word really, but still a conclusion that since there are undifferentiated symptoms with scrub typhus and the diagnosis is fairly late, and there may be treatment failures because routine antibiotics that are used for other bacteria is not effective against this. Although if it is detected, it can be treated with tetracyclines, etc. These are all responsible for the deaths. Knowing about this disease is important from a public health point of view because we know that specific diagnosis is required to start a treatment, and there are a lot of laboratories which are not keeping the ScrubTyphus cards or the ELISA kits with them. They send it somewhere and then there is a delay and the patient, we may lose the patient. Even if one patient is lost, that is a big loss. Thirdly, India has ScrubTyphus. There is no doubt about it. And it is there all over the country. Certain areas may be more, some area may be less. So all the doctors should be aware of this potentially dangerous but easily curable disease. If you know what it is, then you can cure it without a problem. And it is difficult to identify clinically from other acute febrile infections because symptoms are common, fever, chills, etc. Rashes can be there. And especially in Indian population, because of a darker skin hue, those rashes may not be visible, the scars may not be visible. And in case of a agricultural laborer or a rural person, there will be multiple small little scabs here and there. So you are not very sure about it. So high clinical suspicion will remain. And serological tests are still the mainstay, not the PCR, because you don't catch the patient that early. People are using Weil-Felix test, but ELISA IgM is a very useful test for as a screening tool. So with that, thank you all for being here, and I will be happy to answer if there are any questions or clarifications. Here I finish. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Colonel Dr. Roy. That was actually very, how do I call it, detailed and well presented, sir, because you covered everything from A to Z on the specifics of scrub typhus. I had a question, in fact, a couple of questions, so please indulge me. What if I, like you said, it's a disease that is very easy to mimic. There are too many diseases with fever. There are too many diseases with a little bit of rash, lesions, difficult to catch an SCHAR, as you said, because of our dark-skinned approach here. So if I was to be a patient, if I am a patient in a hospital, or if I am a doctor in a hospital, and we are presented with a case, what is the testing methodology you would recommend, given that you don't know it is scrub typhus, you don't know it is scrub typhus, and you're faced with a particular case? So what is the algorithm? What is the process that you would recommend, for someone in that position, so that we can ensure that the correct and timely diagnosis is done, sir?
Well, I think that's a very fair question, and I guess that most of the doctors who are attending to patients do have an algorithm for this acute undifferentiated febrile illnesses. So in India, any fever which is not diagnosed over a period of 7 or 10 days, clinicians do tend to investigate them for typhoid, then dengue, malaria, even chikungunya. So these are the diseases that are done. Specific areas, for example, if it is again the zone of the Bareilly or the Gorakhpur belt or the belts of Assam, people will probably also screen for Japanese encephalitis. If it is say Mumbai or something where there is a lot of leptospirosis that occurs, so people will keep that into mind. So geographical distribution where the people are there, and as I said that in the monsoon time, any clinical illnesses or febrile illnesses And we already have those 4 or 5 diseases that we keep in mind. In Shimoga district or in Ratnagiri district also, people will look for, say, Kyasanur forest disease. So I guess that ScrubTyphus being so endemic, one must add this test in the armamentarium of the test, because the symptoms are absolutely similar to any other test. And many times we do find that despite doing a Vidal's test, or despite doing a malarial ICT, or even doing a blood culture, doing a dengue NS1, chikungunya, and various other tests, we are still not none the wiser. And then we say, okay, this must be one of those viral fevers or something. But then it could very well be ScrubTyphus. And if you remember, some around 2015, 16 in Delhi itself, there was a fair amount of ScrubTyphus that happened here also, and some amount of about 12 to 13 deaths were also reported. So it is there. We are not looking into it. So I guess that in the algorithm already existing for febrile illnesses, one must add the test for ScrubTyphus. If it is not possible to be done in it's a rural setting or something, maybe a card test can be done. And if the card test comes out to be positive, it should be confirmed. But it must be kept in mind that this disease is prevalent, and it can be fatal, it can be lethal, and it can have a lot of morbidity if not treated properly.
Like you said, sir, it's a simple disease if you catch it on time, and deadly if you don't, right? So
Absolutely.
we had a question from the audience, a couple of questions, in fact. One came in from Dr. Arpita, where she asked, for how long post-infection does ScrubTyphusIgM, basically, I guess she's trying to ask about the period by which it can be detected. How long post-infection does ScrubTyphusIgM be detected by the ELISA methodology?
The exact period varies from person to person, depending on the person's own immunological status. In case it is a fresh illness, it is a primary infection. In that case, within 10 days, the clinical symptoms come, and during that is the period, that is the first 7 to 10 days, that the IgM levels will be higher. And over the next, if the infection persists and it is not treated, so it will continue to be there for maybe another 7 to 10 days. So over a period of 15 to 20 days, the IgM will come up, and it will taper down to lower levels. Meanwhile, IgG levels will start rising. However, if this is a secondary infection, that means a person has already had a ScrubTyphus earlier. So in these cases, the symptomatology will be much less severe. And in these cases, what will happen? The IgG levels, because the memory cells are still circulating in the system, they will take over, and quickly the IgG levels will go up. So in many cases, what happens? The diagnosis, IgM diagnosis would say that it's a very fresh infection, but a fourfold rise in IgG would tell that, okay, it's a active illness, that is active ScrubTyphus that is going on. And of course, over a period of time, the IgG levels will go down with treatment, or sometimes the body itself will work against the organism. And but some amount of IgG levels will continue to persist. In some cases, of course, it will totally vanish.
As a follow-up to that last query, sir, is there when you're doing an IgM ELISA for ScrubTyphus, what are the chances of a cross-reactivity? Are there any cross-reactive possibilities?
Cross-reactive possibilities are there with other rickettsial diseases. However, it is unlikely to cross-react with other bacteria per se, except, of course, if there are some heterophile antibodies. But present technology has created these antibodies, monoclonal antibodies, which are fairly specific and sensitive also. So yes, it may cross-react with other other rickettsial diseases. But considering that in India's per se, that ScrubTyphus is the commonest rickettsial organism and the most severe. And so in these cases, there is a lesser chance of cross-reactivity. However, in case there is a doubt about this, other tests like PCR or immunofluorescence assay can be done to cross-check with that to come to a proper diagnosis.
Sir, you talked about the wheel Felix test. It's a highly effective test because it's non-specific, specifically, for ScrubTyphus. It detects a whole host of the diseases. But like you said, in the Indian subcontinent, in the Indian context, it seems to work so far, right? Where do you see the future of this in terms of because if we don't get a specific diagnosis, would it help, the medical practitioners to go in the right or the wrong direction?
Well, what I will say is that Will Felix test has been working very well, and people are using it. But I would really prefer a specific test for this. And so, although it works very well, but if I have a ELISA with me, I would rather go with an ELISA, not with Will Felix test. But having said that, there are other issues with Will Felix tests also, that it requires a little bit of training for understanding that there are multiple reagents present. And then definitely it is a non-specific test, that it's a heterophile antibody detection test. There can be some amount of cross-reactivity. OXK works with Will Felix, but if I have given a choice between a ELISA test and a Will Felix, I will definitely go in for ELISA test.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. There was another question that came in from the audience about what is the pathogenesis of organ failure in typhus?
Okay. So, I mean, it's any organism for that matter actually would give rise to a series of immunological reaction which involves T cells, and first it would go into what is called a systemic inflammatory response syndrome, that is SIRS. And when the SIRS sets in, it initiates a cascade of various proliferation of various cells and proliferation and secretion of various cytokines, lymphokines. So all these factors will actually have effect on the body in general. Plus, the organism continues to multiply. It has got predilections for most of the organs. That includes kidneys, then the liver. So once it affects the liver and affects the kidney because of its proliferation and the systemic inflammatory system response that it initiates, this has got a double effect on the organs, and therefore multiple organs, especially starting from the kidneys and the liver, gets affected. And then slowly it has also the capacity to breach the blood-brain barrier, go into CNS, and cause myocarditis, affect the respiratory system. So at the end of the day, there is a major kind of what is called a cytokine storm that takes place. And this cytokine storm then affects all the organs that comes into play, causes a kind of a shock. And at the end of the day, it is more about the hyperactivity of the immune system that will take over and cause all these systemic failures, etc.
Thank you, sir. I think the word cytokine storm has gained a lot of we learned about it a lot in the COVID era. The 2 years of pandemic, the word cytokine storm came into our dictionary in a big way. But there was another question that came in from one of our participants at the webinar. This was about that she said her question was simple. that if a patient has fever for 8 to 10 days and is IgM ELISA tested for ScrubTyphus, it comes positive. But sometimes patients with a positive ELISA can still come negative with a PCR. What could be the possible cause for that?
See, the possible cause is that the presence of the rickettsia in the blood can be transitory, and it can soon go into the organs. So what happens is that the IgM is something which is an antibody which you are detecting, which is part of the blood. But in case of PCR, you are trying to look for the virus per se, because the primers etc. are all directed against the the organism per se. So depends on that at that point in time when you have done the sampling, whether the rickettsia was actually present in the blood or not, or if it was present, was the level of detection, the kit's level of detection was sufficient to actually detect it. So this is a possibility. And in the first 7 to 10 days, the fever, when the fever comes, and if the PCR is positive, the positive predictive value is very high. But if it comes out to be negative on the 10th or 12th day, but IgM is positive, or you are demonstrating a significant rise in IgG, a fourfold rise in IgG, the diagnosis is fairly certain. This also happens in dengue, you see, that therefore dengue PCR is not that popular. We continue to do with NS1 and the IgM, the MAC ELISAs, because the viremia is a very transient in these cases. However, that's what I said, that in case you can find an eschar, and if the sample is taken from the eschar, the chances of finding the organism there is much better than what is in the blood.
So would you say that the ELISA, if you're tested by ELISA and positive, it would be similar to a confirmatory test in some way?
Confirmatory test is always demonstrating the organism. I mean,
Absolutely.
there's no doubt about it. But I would say that in a case where there's disease is endemic and you are trying to get some sort of a screening test done, I think the mainstay will still remain serological investigation. Yes, if it is along with immunofluorescence or certain other test for direct detection like a PCR, that's better. But otherwise, I would say that high clinical suspicion and presence of and serological markers coming positive is a fairly certain way of diagnosis. I won't say it's a gold standard, but I'll say it's a very practical standard.
Fair enough, sir. I think we live in the era of practicality. So if you're looking at a timeline analysis, the PCR should be done on day 4 or day 5 of the fever, or beyond that, or before that?
I think it should be done. I mean, if it is done in the first within 7 to 10 days of the chigger biting.
Okay, that is the challenge: getting the chigger bite. Demonstrating that and kind of figuring out when that happened.
Yeah,
so
because illness, the febrile illnesses come after about 7 to 10 days after the chigger is actually bitten. So if it is bitten and but yes, if it's in the very initial phases, first 2 to 3 days of fever, so if a PCR is done, it will find. Same thing goes in for, say, typhoid also, that if it is 3 to 4 days of fever, you do a blood culture, you demonstrate the organism, actually grow the organism. But if it is later, then you depend more on the Vidal test showing you higher titers of various antibodies.
Well, Dr. Roy, this is, like I said, scrub typhus is not a new disease, but it's neglected, it's lethal. And I believe that a lot of education and awareness creation will go a long way, in solving the problems that we are facing. If I ask you as a kind of a closing question, sir, you've been in the medical fraternity for what, 27 years, if my memory serves me correct, 85.
Yeah.
So, scrub typhus has been there before that, right? From the time of Frederick in Prussian times.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see this? Are we creating enough awareness about this? That's my question. Because going forward, it's not that the cases are less. It's just that the detection is less because the awareness is low. right? So are we missing out on something? Are we creating a bigger problem for ourselves, healthcare, like bigger healthcare issues for us down the line if we neglect it now?
See, in country like India, which is demonstrably poorer with major challenges in healthcare delivery, and the rural population does not have very strong access to kind of treatment and medical facility that the urban population has. And of course, this is a major challenge. This challenge is compounded by the fact that we have got certain other illnesses like tuberculosis, polio, and other non-infectious diseases like say malnutrition and lots other lifestyle diseases. Scrub typhus has kind of taken a backseat in the entire process. But then this is definitely a illness of which comes under the purview of pyrexia of unknown origin or fever of unknown origin or acute undifferentiated febrile illnesses, and can really cause a problem. Comparatively, I would say that place like Mumbai and all, they have really identified leptospira as a major cause and have geared up. The system has geared up. They know that yes, leptospira is something which is a possibility during the flooding of the Mumbai sewers and all. While the same kind of activity is not happening in maybe rest of the metros and cities where also waterlogging takes place and all. So it is the responsibility of the government, also the public health people, also microbiologists like us, also to try and educate people that and especially the medical fraternity, to keep a very close eye on this and keep a very high clinical suspicion. The moment they start detecting cases, the automatically people will be aware that this is something happening. So until unless the doctors actually don't do the test for this will only remain a gray area. So they do the test, they say okay, they do the test and say no, this is not happening, or they do the test and say yeah, it is happening. So both ways it works.
Well, thank you very much, sir. As is our small tradition, we'd like to present you the small certificate of appreciation for your time, effort, and the very valuable inputs that you've shared with us today, sir. Our team members in Delhi will be reaching out to you shortly. I think you met with Mr. Ritesh very last time. He delivered the certificate to you. We hope to do the same very shortly this week, next week itself for you. And thank you for your time, sir. We look forward to the future and working with you and our association with you on the next set of viral diseases. Looking forward, sir. Thank you for your time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on Scrub Typhus, neglected but lethal. We look forward to joining us on our next webinar coming up in January. See you all. Thank you.